I think that the debate about what needs to be preserved and protected in communities is one that has been always a very strong part of the Labour tradition. We've perhaps forgotten it in recent years. When I say recent years, I mean recent decades. But actually that has always been a very, very strong strand of socialism, and especially working class socialism. And you're starting to see that re-emerge. And it's re-emerging at a time when we've had things like a very divisive referendum on the European Union, in which free movement and immigration became a huge issue. So it was always going to be a difficult conversation to have. And the different traditions that Labour and Tory people come from mean that we use very different language, we often have very different starting points, and we have very different views on a lot of these issues as well. So you're going to see some clash and some conflict. That, to me, is something to be embraced.
Yeah.
We need to front up to this debate. We need to start having these conversations and arguments. The bit that's missing at the moment is that we're having that debate in Westminster and amongst elected politicians. What we're not allowing is that debate to happen in communities themselves, and that is where the solutions come from. So in my constituency in Wigan, a while ago we had an issue with Serco, the company that houses asylum seekers, buying up places in a hotel in a small pit village in my constituency and putting 100 young men, mainly from the African continent, into there overnight with no warning. Immediately the far right started organising. The community was very concerned what was happening. They didn't understand why people were there. They didn't know how long they were staying. They didn't know whether any sort of safety measures were in place or support for those people. And we called a community meeting. We got the police, the local council, me down there to talk to people about why they were there. Serco didn't want anything to do with it, but we went and we talked to people and said to them, look, the council has some powers over this because we take greater numbers of asylum seekers in Wigan than a number of other areas, so we do have some powers. If you want us to use our powers, we can, but we think that they deserve our support. So we asked the people who'd attended that meeting to tell us what they thought, and overwhelmingly they thought that we needed to support those young men, not to try and get them moved out the area.
Would it have been okay if the outcome of that meeting was that they did not want to support them and wanted you to use those powers to say no to them? Would that have been an acceptable
It would have been
vote?
It would have been a huge failure on my part and on the part of the police and the council to articulate why people are there, because actually towns like mine have always been very, very strong on community and supporting one another and sticking up for people who are having a hard time and pulling together to make sure that everybody is lifted up together. And I knew that going into the meeting, and that's why I was confident that despite all the roar and the noise that was being created by a few extremists, that we would come to a different conclusion if and only if people were given the agency and the control and the power back to make decisions about their own community. And that's what had been missing when Serco turned up and said, this is just happening to you.
I guess that's a happy story because, given that forum and with the right information, they came to the conclusion that you wanted. I mean, where it gets more dangerous and difficult is they had all that information and still felt that was too great a number, or they didn't, as a community, they didn't want them.
Sure, but you have to trust people, because all the way through human history, when you look at where hope and love and community flourishes, it's when people feel confident and empowered. And where people feel fearful and scared and demonised and marginalised, that is where you get the fear and the anger and the division. And it's the job of politics, actually, and leaders in communities to create the conditions in which hope and support and community can thrive. I think it's very difficult at the moment, actually, for political parties, because we've got these very, very outdated structures in which you have a very sort of top-down approach, and all of the major political parties spend a lot of time in Westminster and have become quite unmoored in their communities. And what we're starting to see, and I think Labour is definitely playing its part in this, is trying to think seriously about how we start to rebuild those very strong communities in which representatives are anchored. So, for example, the devolution agenda, some quite serious thinking going on within the Labour Party about what that devolution settlement looks like, and about how you give communities power so that they can bubble it up rather than push it down.
That last sentence could have been uttered by Dominic Cummings inside Number 10. I mean, he is an absolute obsessive for devolving power downwards, for people having agency over their own lives. Are there now some strange bedfellows in this movement?
Not Dominic Cummings, no, and I'll explain why. Because actually, although you get a lot of people across the political spectrum talking about empowering communities, we often mean very different things by it. So there's one strand of thought that says we've got to smash the system as it currently stands, and the way that you do that is that you talk about giving power to the people, you smash representative democracy, you question its legitimacy, and in doing so, actually, what you do is you concentrate power in greater hands. There are another group of people, I would count myself amongst this, but also other Tories like Rory Stewart, who think actually the system matters, representative democracy, liberal democracy matters. It protects the rights of minorities, but actually in having a strong constitution, having a strong liberal democratic settlement, it protects all of us. And that is completely and utterly at odds with people like Dominic Cummings and the sort of politics that they represent.
So in the sense of pragmatism, you're more conservative than the radicals in number 10?
Well, there's a social conservatism that has always been a very, very strong part of the Labour tradition that wants to protect and support the things that exist in communities and have existed for some time and that anchor people. And at the moment, when the world feels to a lot of people like it's spinning out of control, that tradition in Labour has never been more important to people in towns like mine, and it's something that we have to rediscover if we're going to be able to speak for very, very different communities across this country.